The last text my aunt sent me before the reunion read, "Brooke, maybe skip this year. The venue is expensive, and we don't want anyone feeling uncomfortable." What she really meant was simple: "You're too poor to stand next to us." 3 hours later, the same woman was frozen in place while over 400 people stood to applaud me, and for the first time in my life, the Harrison family had absolutely nothing to say. Before I tell you what happened, take a second to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy real stories about betrayal, family drama, and the kind of revenge that's earned, not given. Now let me explain why my own family spent 20 years trying to convince me I would never belong. My name is Brooke Harrison. I'm 30 years old. And according to my family, I was the family disappointment before I was old enough to understand what disappointment even meant. The Harrisons weren't old money. They liked pretending they were. My grandfather had started a successful construction company decades ago. By the time I was born, almost everyone in the family had built comfortable lives from that foundation. Large homes, luxury cars, country club memberships, private schools, expensive vacations that somehow always ended with hundreds of photos uploaded online before the plane even landed. Image mattered more than reality, especially to my Aunt Linda. If vanity were an Olympic sport, Linda Harrison would have retired undefeated. Everything had to look perfect: perfect children, perfect husband, perfect dining room, perfect family photographs. And if someone didn't fit that picture, they were quietly pushed outside the frame. My mother never fit. She was my grandfather's youngest child. Unlike her brothers and sisters, she became an elementary school teacher instead of joining the family business. She married my father, a mechanic. That single decision permanently lowered our value in the Harrison ranking system. Nobody ever said it directly. They didn't have to. Family dinners made it obvious. Whenever Uncle Richard bought another vacation home, everyone applauded. When my father proudly announced he'd finally paid off our used pickup truck, the room suddenly found mashed potatoes incredibly fascinating. No one looked up. No one congratulated him. Even as a kid, I noticed. Kids always notice. Christmases became competitions disguised as celebrations. My cousins compared designer shoes. I quietly hoped no one would notice my sneakers came from the clearance rack. Birthdays weren't about cake. They were about gifts. One year, my cousin Madison received a horse. A literal horse. That same year, I got watercolor paints. I loved those paints. I painted with them until every tube was empty. But I also remember hearing Madison whisper to another cousin, "Poor Brooke probably thinks that's expensive." I was 11. She was 12. Children don't invent that kind of cruelty. They inherit it. My parents tried protecting me. Mom always said, "They're measuring success with the wrong ruler." Dad would grin while fixing old engines. "Money buys comfort?" He'd wipe grease from his hands. "Character buys peace." At 12, those words sounded nice. At 16, they sounded like excuses, because every family reunion reminded me exactly where I stood. Always the smallest hotel room, always driving the oldest car, always wearing last year's clothes, always feeling less. The older I became, the more obvious the divide became, especially after Dad got sick. The diagnosis came suddenly: aggressive cancer, within months. Hospital bills swallowed every dollar we'd ever saved. Dad stopped working. Mom picked up tutoring after school. I worked evenings at a grocery store while finishing high school. I remember stocking canned soup at 2 in the morning because overnight shifts paid $1 more per hour. That dollar mattered. Every dollar mattered. Meanwhile, my cousins posted yacht photos on Instagram. Dad died 6 months after I graduated. He was 53. The funeral wasn't large. Most of my Harrison relatives came, stayed exactly 38 minutes, then left because someone had dinner reservations. I noticed. Mom noticed too. She cried that night, not because they left, because she'd expected better. I didn't. That was the day I stopped expecting anything from the Harrison family. And somehow, that made the next decade hurt even more, because every time I thought they'd finally changed, they reminded me exactly who they were. I earned scholarships, worked 3 jobs, graduated with honors, not from an Ivy League university, just a good state school. I couldn't afford prestige. I could afford determination. After graduation, I joined a nonprofit focused on urban redevelopment. The salary wasn't impressive. Actually, it was embarrassingly low compared to what my cousins made in finance, law, or the family construction company. Every reunion featured the same questions. So, when are you getting a real job? Nonprofits don't actually make money. You'll grow out of this charity phase. I smiled, changed the subject, went home feeling smaller every year. Then Mom died. Heart failure, completely unexpected. I was 27. Losing both parents before 30 changes you. Not dramatically, quietly. You stop calling people when good things happen. You stop expecting birthday cards. You realize family isn't measured by blood. It's measured by who stays after everyone else leaves. The Harrisons didn't stay. 3 months after Mom's funeral, the annual reunion invitation arrived. Technically, everyone received one. Mine included a handwritten note from Aunt Linda. Dress code is cocktail attire this year. Translation? Don't embarrass us. I almost laughed. Instead, I stayed home. No one noticed. Or maybe they were relieved. The following year, no invitation came at all. I found out later everyone else had received theirs weeks earlier. When I finally asked my cousin Emily, she awkwardly admitted Aunt Linda assumed I was too busy. No, she assumed I couldn't afford the trip. She wasn't entirely wrong. Money was tight. Rent kept rising. Student loans existed. The nonprofit struggled financially. I drove a 14-year-old Honda with one speaker that actually worked. But here's what nobody understood. I wasn't failing. I was building something. Just not something they recognized yet. Because success doesn't always announce itself with designer handbags. Sometimes, it arrives wearing work boots. Then everything changed. Not overnight. Not because of luck. Because of one phone call. One opportunity. One decision that nobody in my family even knew existed. And when it finally paid off, it didn't just change my career, it made me the one person every Harrison would eventually be forced to applaud. They just didn't know it yet. 3 months before the reunion, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Thankfully, I answered. That single decision would eventually rewrite every relationship I had with my family, but before I understood why, I had to survive the most humiliating message Aunt Linda had ever sent me. And believe me, she outdid herself. The text from Aunt Linda arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I was eating yogurt at my desk because I'd skipped lunch again to finish a grant proposal before the deadline. My phone buzzed. I smiled automatically. For half a second, I hoped it was my friend Ava asking if I wanted dinner after work. Instead, I saw Aunt Linda's name. That alone made my stomach tighten. She never contacted me unless she wanted something, or wanted me to feel something. Usually guilt, occasionally shame, always both. I opened the message. Hi, Brooke, hope you're doing well. I wanted to talk about the reunion next month. Since it's being held at the Grand Ashford Resort this year, everything is a little more upscale than usual. Between accommodations, meals, and activities, it may be financially uncomfortable for some people. Rather than put you in that position, perhaps it's best if you sit this one out. We completely understand. I read it twice, then a third time. Every sentence was polished. Every word was polite. Every syllable dripped with condescension. She hadn't technically forbidden me from coming. She'd simply wrapped an insult in expensive wrapping paper. I stared at the screen while the office around me buzzed with printers, conversations, and ringing phones. No one noticed the heat climbing into my face. No one heard the familiar voice in my head. Maybe she's right. That was the dangerous thing about years of being underestimated. Eventually, part of you starts helping. I locked my phone and tried returning to my work. The numbers blurred together. I couldn't focus. At 5:30, I walked to the parking garage carrying that same weight I'd carried since childhood. The weight of always being the relative who needed to be handled carefully. Not because I was fragile, because I was embarrassing. My apartment wasn't much. 600 square feet. Second floor. Old hardwood floors that creaked if you walked too quickly. A tiny balcony overlooking another apartment building. No luxury, no skyline, no marble countertops. But it was mine. Every piece of furniture had a story. The couch came from a thrift store after I refinished the wooden legs. The dining table had belonged to my parents. Dad had carved my initials underneath it when I was 9. Even after all these years, I still reached underneath sometimes and traced the letters with my fingertips. That evening, I made pasta, poured myself cheap tea, sat by the window, and cried. Not because of the reunion. Not really. It was everything. Dad, Mom, Christmases, birthdays, the jokes, the comparisons, the constant reminders that I occupied the bottom rung of the Harrison ladder. I hated that one text could still hurt this much. I hated that 30-year-old Brooke still carried 16-year-old Brooke inside her. My phone rang around 8. Ava. Tell me why you sound like someone stole your dog. I laughed weakly. They didn't steal my dog. You don't own a dog. I know. So what happened? I read her the message. Silence. Then. Brooke. What? I need you to promise me something. What? Promise me you won't spend another second wondering whether she's right. I leaned back. I know she's wrong. No. She corrected me gently. You know she's cruel. There was a difference. Cruel people don't necessarily believe what they say. They simply know which words leave the deepest cuts. Ava had known me for 8 years. We met on my first day at the nonprofit. She'd become my closest friend because she'd never once asked where I lived before deciding whether I mattered. She judged people by how they treated waiters, not by what they drove, an increasingly rare quality. You're coming over Friday, she said. I'm busy. No. I have work. You have emotional damage. I laughed despite myself. Very funny. I'm serious. You need a reminder that your family's version of reality isn't reality. Friday night became pizza, old movies, board games, normal conversation, the kind that doesn't involve salaries, investment portfolios, or square footage. Sometimes healing isn't dramatic. Sometimes it's just spending an evening with people who don't make you feel like you're interviewing for the right to exist. Monday morning, everything changed. Again, an email appeared from a name I didn't recognize, Dr. Samuel Ortega. Subject: regarding the East Harbor Initiative. I opened it. He introduced himself as chairman of the East Harbor Foundation, one of the largest urban redevelopment organizations in the country. Apparently, someone had recommended my work. Not my resume, not my title, my work. They'd been following a neighborhood revitalization program my team had quietly built over the previous 3 years. Our budget had been tiny. Our results had been enormous. Vacant buildings transformed into affordable housing. Small businesses returning. Crime decreasing. Families moving back. We'd never received much media attention. But apparently, the right people had noticed. He wanted to meet. I spent the entire train ride downtown rehearsing every possible disaster. What if they expected someone older? Someone with executive experience? Someone wearing a suit that cost more than my monthly rent? When I entered the foundation headquarters, I almost turned around. The lobby looked like an art museum. Glass walls, natural light, massive sculptures, people speaking quietly into wireless headsets. I felt underdressed immediately. Old instincts, always assuming I didn't belong. The receptionist smiled warmly. "Ms. Harrison?" "Yes. They're expecting you." No judgment, no hesitation, just professionalism. Funny how simple kindness can feel revolutionary after years of subtle rejection. Dr. Ortega turned out to be in his early 60s. Gray hair, warm eyes, the kind of handshake that didn't try proving anything. He asked me about neighborhoods, families, community trust, local businesses. Not once did he ask where I'd gone to school, how much money I made, who my family was. He cared about impact. At the end of the meeting, he folded his hands. "Do you know why I wanted to meet you?" "I assumed the redevelopment project." He smiled. "Partly." He opened a folder. Inside were newspaper articles, research papers, grant reports, every major project I'd worked on. "I've spent 38 years interviewing talented people." I swallowed. "And? I've noticed something?" "What?" "The people who quietly solve impossible problems rarely spend much time talking about themselves." I didn't know what to say. He continued. "We're creating a national initiative." He slid another folder toward me. "We'd like you to lead it." I blinked. "I'm sorry." "As executive director." I actually laughed, not because it was funny, because my brain rejected the possibility. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else." "No." He smiled again. "We've been looking for you for 6 months." The position paid almost 3 times my current salary. National visibility, major partnerships, government collaboration, speaking engagements, media interviews, a chance to influence redevelopment across the country instead of one city. It wasn't just a promotion. It was everything I'd spent 10 years working toward, quietly, without anyone noticing, especially my family. I accepted 2 weeks later. The announcement wouldn't be public until the annual National Community Renewal Summit, the biggest event in the industry. Over 400 leaders attending, mayors, business executives, developers, philanthropists, journalists, one keynote speaker, one guest of honor. Me. I almost cried reading the schedule, not because of the title, because I suddenly wished my parents could see it. Dad would have framed the program. Mom would have cried before I even reached the stage. Instead, I celebrated with Ava. We ordered Chinese takeout, drank sparkling cider because neither of us had remembered to buy champagne. It was perfect. A week later, another email arrived. This time from the summit organizers. They'd secured the Grand Ashford Resort. I frowned. That name sounded familiar. Then it hit me. The reunion. Same weekend, same hotel. Different event. The Harrison family had rented the East Ballroom. The summit occupied the convention center and grand ballroom. Thousands of guests, hundreds of rooms, completely separate events. I almost laughed at the coincidence. Until another email appeared. The organizers wanted me to attend the Friday evening welcome reception, Saturday keynote, Saturday awards dinner, Sunday leadership breakfast, guest of honor, all expenses covered. Luxury suite included, car service, everything. I stared at the reservation details. Room 1802, penthouse level. The reunion guests? Floors 7 through 10. I shook my head. Life had an odd sense of humor. Then came the phone call. Uncle Richard. He almost never called. "Brooke." His voice sounded unusually cheerful. "Hi. We heard you might still be thinking about the reunion." I hadn't decided. "Well," he hesitated. "The resort is rather expensive." There it was again. "I know." "So." Long pause. We'd completely understand if you skipped it. I smiled sadly. You've all become very concerned about my finances. He laughed awkwardly. No, no. We're just trying to help. Help. Interesting word. Because people who actually help don't spend 20 years reminding you that you need it. After hanging up, I looked at my itinerary again. Car service, suite, guest credentials, reserved seating, keynote address, guest of honor. None of them knew. None of them had any idea why I'd be walking through those same hotel doors. For the first time in my life, I knew something the Harrisons didn't. Not because I'd hidden it, because they'd never cared enough to ask. And suddenly, I wasn't sure I wanted to tell them, because a small, quiet part of me, a part I'd spent years trying to ignore, wondered what their faces would look like if they discovered the truth the hard way. Not through a phone call, not through social media, but in front of everyone, at exactly the right moment. The thought frightened me. Then, it thrilled me. For the first time in years, I wasn't imagining how I'd survive another Harrison reunion. I was imagining something entirely different. What if this time, they were the ones who felt like they didn't belong? For 3 days after hanging up with Uncle Richard, I wrestled with a question that surprised me. Should I tell them? It seemed like the mature thing to do. Send a quick message. Actually, I'll be at the Grand Ashford that weekend for work. Simple, polite, honest. But every time I started typing, I stopped. Not because I wanted revenge. At least, that's what I told myself. It was because I knew exactly what would happen. They wouldn't ask what I'd accomplished. They'd ask who had given me the opportunity, who I knew, who had pulled strings. The Harrisons had never been comfortable believing I'd earned anything. If I succeeded, someone must have helped me. If I failed, it was entirely my fault. There was never another option. So I deleted every draft. For once, I decided they could learn about my life the same way they'd spent years forcing me to learn about theirs, by paying attention. The month before the summit became the busiest of my career. There were media interviews to prepare for, panels to coordinate, speeches to edit, background briefings, endless meetings. The Foundation's communications team insisted I needed professional photographs. When the photographer asked me to stand a little taller, I laughed. I've spent most of my life trying to make myself smaller. She lowered the camera. Why? I almost answered. Instead, I smiled. Old habit. She nodded as though she understood. Maybe she did. One afternoon, Dr. Ortega invited me into his office. You've rewritten the keynote 3 times. I know. Why? It isn't good enough. He leaned back. Brooke. I looked up. Who are you trying to impress? The audience. No. He smiled gently. You're trying to convince someone who won't even be in the room. His words hit harder than he realized. Because he was wrong. The people I was trying to convince would absolutely be in the building, just not in the ballroom. A week before the event, the summit organizers emailed the final program. There it was, printed in bold letters. Saturday evening gala guest of honor, Brooke Harrison, recipient of the National Community Leadership Award. My heart skipped. Seeing my name in black and white felt unreal. I thought about forwarding the program to Aunt Linda. Instead, I closed my laptop. No. If life had arranged this coincidence, I wasn't going to interfere. The Friday morning of the summit arrived with heavy gray clouds hanging over the city. The kind of weather that made everything feel suspended, as though something important was waiting just beyond the horizon. A black sedan pulled up outside my apartment. The driver stepped out before I reached the curb. Ms. Harrison? That's me. He loaded my suitcase into the trunk. I looked back at my apartment building. Peeling paint, tiny balconies, the elderly woman downstairs watering flowers, the mailboxes that jammed every winter. I smiled. This place had witnessed every version of me: the broke college graduate, the grieving daughter, the exhausted nonprofit worker, the woman who almost believed she wasn't enough. Leaving it that morning felt strangely emotional. Not because I was saying goodbye, because I realized I'd stopped apologizing for where I came from. The Grand Ashford Resort appeared around a curve in the highway. Even from a distance, it looked more like a palace than a hotel. Glass towers reflected the cloudy sky, water fountains danced in front of the entrance, luxury cars lined the circular driveway. The same place Aunt Linda had described as too expensive for me. The driver opened my door. A bellman greeted me by name before I even reached the entrance. "Welcome, Ms. Harrison." He already knew who I was. That simple fact felt surreal. Inside, the lobby buzzed with activity. Conference staff arranged banners. Attendees checked in. Reporters adjusted camera equipment. The summit logo covered digital displays throughout the hotel. I collected my conference badge. The receptionist smiled brightly. "We're honored to have you with us." Honored. Such a simple word. Yet I'd spent years around people who acted embarrassed by my existence. The suite occupied an entire corner of the 18th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the lake. Fresh flowers waited on the dining table. A handwritten welcome note sat beside a basket of fruit. "We're delighted to celebrate your leadership this weekend." I stood in the middle of the room for nearly a minute. Not moving, not speaking, just breathing. It wasn't the luxury that overwhelmed me, it was respect. No one here knew anything about my family. No one cared. They respected my work. Nothing else. Around 4 that afternoon, I headed downstairs for the welcome reception. As the elevator doors opened into the main lobby, I heard a familiar laugh. My stomach tightened instantly. Madison. She hadn't changed much. Designer handbag, perfect hair, perfect makeup, perfect posture. She looked exactly like someone who'd spent years practicing how to appear effortlessly superior. She spotted me almost immediately. For half a second, genuine surprise crossed her face. Then came the smile. The Harrison smile. Beautiful. Cold. "Oh my God." She walked over, hugging me with the enthusiasm of someone greeting a distant coworker. "Brooke." "Hi, Madison. I didn't know you were coming. I had business here." She glanced around the lobby. "You mean nearby?" "No. Here." Another pause. "Really?" She looked at my conference badge, but it had flipped backward. She couldn't read it. "That's nice." There it was. Confusion, not curiosity. She hadn't expected me to belong inside this building unless I was delivering food. "So," she adjusted the strap on her handbag. "Where are you staying?" I almost laughed. "Here." Her eyebrows lifted. "The resort?" "Yes." "Oh." Long silence. "I thought these rooms started around $800 a night." "They do." She waited for an explanation. I didn't give one. Finally, she smiled. "Well, good for you." Not congratulations, not happiness, suspicion. The Harrisons never accepted unexplained success. Before either of us could say more, Aunt Linda appeared. She froze the moment she saw me. "Oh." Not hello. Just, "Oh. I thought you received my message." "I did." "And?" "I decided to come." Her smile tightened almost invisibly. "I hope you didn't stretch your budget for this." There it was. Not even 30 seconds. She couldn't help herself. I answered calmly. "I'm comfortable. I'm glad." She looked around again. "We're actually on our way to the reunion welcome dinner." "I'm heading to an event too." She nodded politely. "Well?" Another forced smile. "Enjoy yourself." She turned to leave, then stopped. "Oh." She looked back. "If you happen to run into the family this weekend, She lowered her voice. The reunion is private. For a moment, I didn't understand. Then I realized. She thought I might try joining their dinner. She was warning me not to embarrass them. I understand. I knew you would. She walked away looking relieved. I watched her disappear into the crowd. Oddly, I didn't feel angry, just tired. How exhausting it must be to spend decades worrying about appearances. The summit reception filled the west terrace overlooking the lake. Hundreds of attendees mingled beneath soft lights. A string quartet played quietly in the background. I spoke with city planners, architects, housing advocates, people who cared about rebuilding neighborhoods instead of reputations. For the first time all day, I relaxed. Around 7, Dr. Ortega introduced me to several major donors. One of them, Eleanor Bishop, had funded affordable housing projects across 5 states. She shook my hand warmly. "I've wanted to meet you." I smiled. "Thank you. I've read every report you've written." Every report. Meanwhile, half my family couldn't remember where I worked. As we talked, I noticed movement across the lobby through the glass doors. The reunion dinner had ended. Groups of Harrisons wandered toward the elevators, laughing, talking loudly. Then, several of them stopped. They were looking through the glass, at me. More specifically, at the people standing around me: Dr. Ortega, Mayor Lewis, Eleanor Bishop, journalists, executives. I watched confusion spread from face to face. Madison whispered something to Aunt Linda. Linda frowned. Uncle Richard squinted. None of them came closer. They simply watched, trying to solve a puzzle. Who were these people? Why were they talking to Brooke? Why did they seem to know her? For once, I had answers they didn't. The next morning brought my first panel discussion. The ballroom held nearly 600 people. I spoke about neighborhood trust, listening before leading, treating communities like partners instead of projects. Afterward, dozens of attendees approached to ask questions. A young woman in her 20s stopped me near the exit. "I almost quit nonprofit work last year." She smiled nervously. "Your story reminded me why I started." I thanked her. As she walked away, I felt something I hadn't expected. Pride. Not because of applause, because maybe my journey actually mattered to someone else. Saturday afternoon, I finally crossed paths with my cousin Ethan. Unlike most of the family, Ethan had never been openly cruel, mostly passive. The kind of person who watched injustice quietly because speaking up was inconvenient. He spotted me near the coffee shop. "Brooke?" "Hey." He looked genuinely happy to see me. "I heard you were here." "I am." "What are you doing?" "Conference?" "What kind?" "Urban redevelopment." "Oh." He nodded. "Work thing?" "Yes." He smiled. "That's cool." For a second I thought the conversation might remain normal. Then he asked, "So who are you here with?" There it was again. Not. "What are you doing?" But, "Who brought you?" I answered simply. "Myself?" He laughed awkwardly. "No, I mean, I know what you meant." He looked embarrassed. "I didn't." "It's okay." "No." He sighed. "It really isn't." For the first time in years, one of the Harrisons actually looked ashamed. Not of me, of himself. "I'm sorry, Brooke." The words were quiet, almost swallowed by the noise around us. "I should have called after your mom died." I blinked. He continued. "I kept thinking about it." "But you didn't." "No." He looked down. "I didn't." Honesty. Painful, but honest. I was a coward. I nodded slowly. "Thank you for saying that." We stood in silence. Sometimes apologies don't erase anything. They simply stop the bleeding. That evening, I returned to my suite to prepare for the gala. The black dress the foundation had selected hung near the window. Elegant, Simple. Nothing flashy. As I adjusted the necklace Mom had left me, I caught my reflection. For years, I'd looked into mirrors searching for signs that I belonged. Enough money, enough confidence, enough success. Now, I realized belonging had never been something my family could grant or take away. A knock interrupted my thoughts. The event coordinator smiled from the doorway. Ms. Harrison. Yes? They're ready for you backstage. I took one last breath. As we walked toward the grand ballroom, I heard applause echo faintly through the hallway. Hundreds of voices. Waiting. The coordinator glanced at me. Nervous? A little. She smiled. Good. Why? People who stop getting nervous usually stop caring. I smiled back. The ballroom doors remained closed. Behind them sat nearly 500 guests. Just beyond another corridor, the Harrison family reunion banquet was beginning its annual awards ceremony, separated by only a few walls. Completely unaware that, in less than 20 minutes, those walls, and every assumption they'd built over decades, were about to come crashing down. The hallway outside the grand ballroom was almost silent. Not because no one was there, because everyone backstage understood that in less than a minute, the evening would begin. Volunteers moved with practiced precision. Camera operators adjusted lenses. Servers lined up with trays. Someone clipped a microphone onto the back of my dress. The event coordinator smiled reassuringly. You'll enter after Dr. Ortega finishes the introduction. I nodded. My hands were colder than I expected. Not from fear of public speaking. I'd spoken before. It was something else. Somewhere else in this enormous hotel, the Harrison family was probably clinking glasses, congratulating one another, comparing investment portfolios, and deciding which cousin had become the biggest success this year. None of them knew they were only a short walk away from discovering how wrong they'd been about me. The coordinator placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. They're ready. The ballroom lights dimmed. The applause faded. Then Dr. Ortega walked onto the stage. I stood behind the curtain, listening. He welcomed everyone, thanked the sponsors, recognized elected officials and community leaders. The audience applauded politely. Then his voice slowed. There is one more person we want to recognize tonight. I closed my eyes for a second. Not because I needed courage, because I suddenly wished my parents were alive. Dad would have leaned over to Mom and whispered, "That's our girl." Mom would have cried before I even reached the stage. That thought almost broke me. Instead, I inhaled slowly. I wasn't walking onto that stage alone. Every sacrifice they'd made was walking with me. Dr. Ortega continued. When people hear the phrase community leader, many imagine someone who begins with power. He paused. But real leadership rarely begins with power. It begins with service, with listening, with showing up long before anyone is paying attention. Images appeared on the massive screens behind him. Neighborhood photographs, children planting trees, families reopening small businesses, apartment buildings that had once been abandoned. Then, pictures of me, wearing work boots, holding blueprints, laughing with volunteers, sitting on broken sidewalks talking with residents. No makeup, no designer clothes, just work. The room grew quiet, very quiet. Then he said my name. For 10 years, she has quietly transformed communities while asking for nothing in return. Tonight, we recognize not only extraordinary achievement, but extraordinary character. Please welcome our National Community Leadership Award recipient, Ms. Brooke Harrison. The ballroom exploded. Hundreds of people rose to their feet. The applause wasn't polite. It rolled through the room like thunder. I stepped onto the stage. For one surreal moment, all I could hear was clapping. Not criticism, not comparison, not whispered judgments. Applause. Pure, unreserved, earned. As I reached the podium, I looked across the audience. Rows upon rows of people smiling, some already standing, some wiping tears. I wasn't expecting emotion to hit me that quickly. I swallowed hard. Thank you. The microphone carried my voice across the room. I've rewritten this speech more times than I'd like to admit. Laughter. I kept thinking I needed the perfect words. But standing here, I've realized something. The perfect words aren't complicated. So I'll start with two. Thank you. More applause. I looked toward the front row where Dr. Ortega smiled encouragingly. Then I began telling the story of neighborhoods that had believed no one cared, families who'd been overlooked, children who deserved safe streets. I never mentioned my own family. I didn't need to, because while I spoke about forgotten communities, I realized I was also speaking about myself. Halfway through the speech, movement near the ballroom entrance caught my attention. The doors opened quietly. A small group entered. Not conference attendees. Hotel guests. They had apparently wandered in after mistaking the ballroom for another event. At the front of that group, Aunt Linda, behind her, Madison, Uncle Richard, three other cousins. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. They looked confused. Then they looked at the giant screens. My face filled both displays. Then they looked at the stage. At me. Speaking. The realization spread across their faces one by one. Confusion, recognition, disbelief. Aunt Linda's mouth actually fell open. Madison looked from the audience to the stage and back again as though she expected someone to explain what she was seeing. No one did. An usher quietly approached them. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I watched the usher point toward empty seats near the back. The Harrisons sat down, silently, for perhaps the first time in their lives. They entered a room where no one cared who they were. They weren't the important family. They weren't the wealthiest people present. They weren't even noticed. They were simply members of the audience, watching me. I continued speaking. Not to them. Never to them. To everyone else. I spoke about dignity, about rebuilding trust, about the danger of judging potential by appearance. Communities, I said, don't become stronger because someone wealthy arrives to save them. They become stronger because someone finally believes they were worth believing in. I noticed Aunt Linda lower her eyes. Whether from embarrassment or coincidence, I couldn't tell. It didn't matter. When I finished, the audience stood again. Another standing ovation. Longer this time. The award itself was beautiful. A piece of hand-carved glass mounted on polished walnut. Dr. Ortega handed it to me. Then he leaned toward the microphone. I should add one final thing. The applause faded. When our selection committee reviewed nominations, there was complete agreement. Not a single dissenting vote. He smiled. That almost never happens. The audience applauded again, behind them. I caught sight of Madison. She wasn't clapping immediately. Then she realized everyone else was. Slowly, almost reluctantly. She raised her hands and joined them. The cousin who once laughed because I thought watercolor paints were expensive was now applauding me because everyone else already was. Life has an extraordinary sense of irony. The gala ended nearly an hour later. Guests surrounded me. Mayors, journalists, students, donors, people asking questions, taking photographs, sharing stories. By the time I finally stepped into the hallway, it was almost 10 o'clock. Someone called my name. Brooke. I turned. Aunt Linda stood alone. Gone was the polished confidence she wore like jewelry. She looked older, smaller. I'd like a minute. I considered walking away. Instead, I nodded. We found a quiet corner overlooking the lake. For several seconds she said nothing. Finally, "I didn't know. I know. If I had." She stopped. I finished the sentence for her. "You would have treated me differently." Her eyes widened. "I. You would have." She looked away. "I would have been proud." I smiled sadly. "No. You would have been impressed. There's a difference." Silence. Painful silence. Because she knew I was right. "I was trying to protect you," she finally offered. "From what?" "Feeling uncomfortable." I looked directly into her eyes. "Linda." It was the first time in my life I hadn't called her Aunt Linda. "You weren't protecting me. You were protecting the image you wanted your friends to see." She opened her mouth, closed it again. No defense came, because there wasn't one. "You know what hurt the most?" I asked quietly. "It wasn't the money jokes. It wasn't the comparisons. It wasn't even the reunion message." She looked surprised. "It was that none of you ever asked if I was happy." Her eyes filled, not dramatically, just enough to catch the light. "You asked about salaries, houses, cars, but nobody ever asked whether I loved my work, whether I slept well, whether I missed Mom, whether I was okay." She whispered, "I didn't realize." "I know. And that's the problem." She cried, very quietly. "I'd like to make things right." I believed she meant it, genuinely. But some things cannot be repaired in a single conversation. "I hope you do," I answered. "But not for me." She frowned. "For everyone else in this family who's still trying to earn your approval." Before she could respond, another voice interrupted. "Brooke?" "Ethan." He walked over looking almost embarrassed. "I wanted to congratulate you." "Thank you." He smiled. "I watched the whole speech." "I'm glad." He shook his head. "You know, when we were kids, I honestly believed success looked like Madison's life." He laughed softly. "Turns out it looks more like yours." That sentence meant more to me than the award, because it proved something had shifted. Not just in me, in someone else. The rest of the reunion weekend became strangely quiet. Word spread quickly through the Harrison family. By breakfast the next morning, everyone knew. Cousins who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly wanted coffee. Uncles asked about my projects. An aunt requested my business card. One even joked that she'd always known I'd do great things. I smiled politely, but something inside me had changed. I no longer needed their approval, and because I no longer needed it, their praise carried almost no weight. It wasn't cruel. It was simply too late. Before checking out, I walked alone around the lake behind the resort. Morning sunlight reflected across the water. For the first time in years, I thought about my parents without immediately feeling grief. Instead, I felt gratitude. Dad had been right. Money buys comfort, character buys peace. Mom had been right, too. People really do measure success with the wrong ruler. For years, I'd believed my family was judging me. The truth was, they were revealing themselves. Every joke, every comparison, every dismissal, every invitation that never came, none of it had described my worth. It had described theirs. And understanding that changed everything. A month later, I received a handwritten letter. Not an email, not a text. A real letter. From Aunt Linda. It wasn't perfect. It didn't erase 20 years. But for the first time, she apologized without explaining herself. No excuses, no qualifications, just accountability. I appreciated it. I even wrote back. Forgiveness, I discovered, isn't pretending the past never happened. It's refusing to let the past continue deciding who you become. Did we become a perfect family? No. Some relationships remained distant, A few cousins never contacted me again. Others slowly changed. Ethan volunteered with one of our housing projects 6 months later. Madison surprised everyone by anonymously funding a scholarship for first-generation college students. Whether guilt inspired her or growth did, I honestly didn't care. The scholarship would help students. That was enough. People sometimes ask whether that night was the greatest revenge of my life. They're always disappointed by my answer. Because the standing ovation wasn't the revenge. The award wasn't the revenge. Watching my family stare at the stage in stunned silence wasn't even the revenge. Those were only moments. The real revenge happened years earlier. Every morning, I chose kindness over bitterness. Every night, I kept working after people dismissed me. Every community I helped rebuild. Every family who found a safe place to live. Every child who grew up believing their neighborhood mattered. That was the revenge. Because while my relatives were busy deciding whether I belonged at a reunion, I was quietly becoming someone the world couldn't ignore. And by the time they finally noticed, I no longer needed them to. If there's one lesson I carried away from that weekend, it's this. Never let people who measure your value by your bank account decide how much you're worth. The loudest people in the room aren't always the most successful. The richest people aren't always the happiest. And the relatives who spend the most time judging others are often trying to hide what they're afraid others will see in them. You don't have to win every argument. You don't have to answer every insult. Sometimes the strongest response is to keep building your life so quietly, so honestly, and so well that one day your success speaks before you ever have to. That weekend, I walked into the Grand Ashford believing I'd finally proven something. I walked out realizing I hadn't. The only person I'd needed to prove anything to was the frightened little girl who once believed clearance rack sneakers determined her future. She was finally free. If you've ever been underestimated by family, judged because of your finances, or treated like you would never amount to anything, I hope this story reminded you of one thing. The people who laugh at your beginning rarely get to write your ending. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more unforgettable revenge stories, and let me know in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Brooke's place?